Okay. So we have officially moved to the third Tuesday of the month through the rest of this um, spring semester, I guess we can call it. And Karen pointed out to me that my sign was wrong, so I fixed that. So thank you, Karen, for getting us lined up here properly. So today, our question of the day is, what is Christian perseverance? Yes. Every time I typed it, I had too many R's, so I had to, hopefully I didn't leave any of those. Perseverance. Um, does anybody remember who asked this question?
No, wasn't me.
No. I wasn't really sure what to do with this. Um,
Was
so
it
I did,
one of the prophets?
so I did several things. Well, we all ask all the questions that I come up with for this come
Oh,
from
I
from
thought
our
you meant
group.
in the biblically
And,
who asked.
yeah, no, and I sometimes I remember who
Oh, it
asked
wouldn't
the
have been a
question,
prophet
and
because it wouldn't have been a Christian.
yeah, this time I didn't remember. All right, so let's do some defining as we like to do with our what is questions. So, what is perseverance? Anybody?
Um, Intuitiveness, pushing through.
Pushing through.
It is the ability of the licorice jelly bean to survive when all others fall.
They don't last at my house.
They wouldn't last at mine either, but I'm an exception.
Well, I think I think it's just hanging in there, isn't it? I
Hmm?
you
Hanging
just
in there.
you
Yeah.
just hang on. Yeah.
So I looked up a few definitions. Merriam-Webster gives us continued effort to do or achieve something despite difficulties, failure, or opposition. And Collins gives us steady persistence in a course of action, a purpose, a statement, etc., especially in spite of difficulties, obstacles, or discouragement. And I thought this was interesting in light of where we're going to go with this today. In biology, the continued existence of a species or trait despite adverse circumstances. So, perseverance of a species is actually a concept in biology because of um, Darwin and the idea that when a particular trait is um, undesirable, it should be evolving away, right, from existence rather than continuing. And so if it perseveres, then that is actually a challenge within that evolutionary scientific world. I thought that was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I wanted to point out and see what you think of this, but I kind of agree with this, but what I want to see what your thoughts are. So I thought about, what's the difference between perseverance and persistence, perseverance and endurance, other words that are similar. And a couple of the articles that I was looking at, one of them had this chart that I think really nicely summarizes kind of what several of these different people were trying to express. That endurance assumes that there is a difficulty. It assumes that there is some kind of adversity to overcome, but it's fairly smooth, it's fairly even. So endurance is required to to finish the reps on your exercise machine. And it gets a little steeper each time because your muscles are getting tired and wearing out. So you endure through that difficulty, and it feels like it's getting harder as you go, because the circumstances are changing a little bit, but it's a smooth arch upward. Whereas perseverance has to do with the changing levels of his hostility and difficulty, and and so perseverance is actually more difficult according to these people that see it this way, because when you're dealing with endurance, you are kind of you already kind of have a baseline of what you're willing to accept, and then something happens that makes it a little harder, but you can kind of do that, and then a little harder and a little harder and a little harder, and you slowly inch your way up. Whereas with perseverance, things could get better and easier for a little while and then all of a sudden get much harder, and then maybe flatten out a little bit, or get easier again and then get harder all of a sudden. And so it's challenging because comparing your circumstances to what just happened most recently, um, doesn't kind of prepare you necessarily for the next step. Things are going to fluctuate. Does anybody have any feelings, good or bad, about that potential interpretation and understanding of perseverance?
Hmm. It makes sense.
So basically, it's what your recency bias is telling you is hard is the difference between these two.
Yeah, that's kind of what they're saying, is endurance is easier, not because it um, requires less of you at the end of the day, but because it requires more of you from moment to moment.
Gotcha.
I don't know. I all these words words mean things, right? And all the little nuances to the words are really interesting to me, and how different people see the different those nuances, and how they interpret them is really fascinating to me. So this is an interesting concept. I don't know. I don't have any strong feelings about it. I think I'm willing to you say, sure, that sounds good to me. I don't have anything against this, but I also don't, I guess I don't have enough experience with that particular word to say, yes, yes, definitely that's what this means.
Well, I see the difference too in that with the perseverance, you have to dig yourself out of the ditch every once in a while.
Uh-huh.
I mean, that's hard to do.
Yeah. So if we go with this definition, then, you know, I'm not, like I said, I'm not opposed to it. So if we go with this definition, then as we try to think about, what does this mean from a Christian perspective? And the reason I asked you all if anybody remembered who asked the question, I'm interested to know what the context of this question is, where this question is coming from. Because to me, when I read this question, my brain immediately goes to our to Hebrews 12, because it's my favorite passage in the Bible. So Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 to 4, pretty familiar. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, that therefore is referring back to chapter 11, where the writer goes through kind of all the heroes of the faith and talks about what they accomplished through faith, and then says, therefore, since you've got all of these people to look to for inspiration and motivation, since we're surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who, for the sake of the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such hostility against himself from sinners, so that you may not grow weary or lose heart. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. So, where my brain goes with this is to here with Hebrews. And then because of my theological education, it goes to is it whose responsibility is it to maintain this perseverance? I look at the picture, the illustration, and think about if we're going to define perseverance as, continuing despite adversity, digging yourself out of those ditches, like Karen said, continuing to move along at some pace, regardless of what comes at you at any given moment. Um, you've got the goal in mind, and you're not giving up on that goal at all. Then my brain immediately goes to Hebrews. But the challenge with a passage like this, coming from the theological background that I come from, it's interesting that this is my favorite passage of scripture because it's actually fairly anti-Calvinist. And I'm going to talk a lot about that tonight. We're going to learn a little bit about some different traditions that are not our own, or at least for those of you who are staunchly Lutheran will not be as familiar with this stuff, but still within that Christian tradition to try to understand this concept of Christian perseverance and who's in charge of this anyway? Who's responsible for this idea? Obviously, if you think about it for a second, the concept of persevering in whatever you're doing as a Christian is good, right? You want to persevere in your faith. You want to persevere in being the person that God wants you to be, in your spiritual disciplines, in your service to others, all of these different things. It's a good thing, but it's hard, right? And sometimes it feels like we can't be necessarily held responsible for maintaining this all the time. And especially when it comes to a Calvinist perspective, we need to question this a little bit. And I think Lutherans, and Bob, you can tell me if I'm wrong on this, but I think Lutherans, if they were to think about this a little bit, they would care about this too, because this is imposing on that idea of God's grace in some ways if you look at it from the wrong perspective. So does that sound good to everybody, that this is kind of the tack I'm taking with this?
I don't understand what you just said.
That's okay. If
That
you're
it's
willing to go with me, we'll get there.
Okay.
well, I'm imposing on God's grace. I think what I'm understanding, not sure, is that this verse or this passage kind of points to our enduring. Where is it? Let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus to pioneer the perfecter of our faith. So it's not. It almost sounds like a faith by works,
Yes.
grace by works.
Yes.
In a way, is that what you're
That's
talking about?
That's the problem. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That's what I understood you to say.
Yes. So
Okay.
if my perseverance, if my Christian perseverance is my responsibility, then we start to have this issue with grace. So let's back up a little bit and kind of start at the beginning. So Jacob Arminius was a theologian, Dutch, if you're interested in that, in the mid to late 1500s. So he was after Martin Luther, who was, he nailed the theses in 1517. And did he live as late as 1560, Bob? I don't think he did. No, he did. Is Bob still with us? Guess not. Anyway, in terms of the center of Luther's the height of Luther's influence, he started in 1517, and in the 1530s he was writing all his stuff and making all his comments. There's Bob.
I'm here. He died in 1546.
46, yes. So by 1560 he's long gone, and we've moved on to other theologians and a new generation of thinkers in this whole Reformation idea. So Arminius, he he had a particular view about this whole grace thing. He thought that Luther and some of the thinkers that came after Luther were giving too much weight to God's grace and too much weight um, to God's action at the expense of human action and human free will. So we've talked about the issue of free will versus, God's providence and things like that in this class before. Um, but so Arminius, the kind of key ideas that he touted were that humans are able to choose or not choose to respond to the gift of salvation through Jesus Christ. So we have the option to choose or not choose. And in a minute, when we get to Calvinism, you'll see that that's very different than the concept of irresistible grace. Um, he also talked about election, God choosing people as being conditional. So we have the we have the final say. Free will is at the top of the rung here. Humans have the final say in whether they're going to accept Jesus. Election, God's choosing of who is going to be saved, is actually just because God knows who's going to say yes and who's going to say no. So it's not that God says, okay, so when Ryan is born, I'm deciding that Ryan is going to be saved, and Ryan has no choice in the matter. It is what it is. That's just how it's going to be. And then Cindy, sorry, when you're born, I'm deciding that you're eternally damned. That's just how it's going to be. You have no choice in the matter. Arminius said, no, that doesn't make any sense. We have free will. We are able to choose. We are able to take the information that we're given and figure out how we're going to respond to it. And it just looks like God's election of Ryan and not Cindy, it looks like God is predetermining that, but it's really based on because God knows what's going to happen. God knows that Ryan is going to be born and choose to accept Jesus, and that Cindy's going to be born and choose not to accept Jesus. And so that's how election works. It's conditional based on the decision that is going to be made by that person. And so the person has all the power in this situation, even though it kind of looks like God did it. Similarly with atonement, or with the making right of the people in the eyes of God. Arminius says that Jesus died for everyone, and so that means that anyone can be saved by believing in him, but that they get to decide whether they want to be saved or not. And so the the action of Jesus is unlimited in terms of it's accessible to everyone, but God already knows who is and who is not going to accept it. And so that's why election kind of looks the way that it looks like election, but it's really not. It's just God knows ahead of time what's going to happen. There's a difference between, for Arminius, there's a difference between God knowing that something is going to happen and God making it happen. And he's very uncomfortable with the idea that God makes all of this stuff happen. He thinks that free will is so important. And then he talks about, finally, conditional preservation. Now, preservation and perseverance are words that in some ways are interchangeable in this conversation. That preservation or perseverance in this context kind of actually refers to that biology thing, that the continued existence of the belief or the believer, the trait of belief, or the species of the believer. I suppose you could interchange with that biology and definition. Um, for Arminius, believers are saved and continue to be saved as long as they continue to believe. And if they stop believing, if they decide, if they choose, they exercise their free will and stop believing, then they are no longer saved. Their preservation, the continued existence of their salvation is conditional on their continuing to choose it. So there's a lot of power for Arminius within um, within the free will of humans, so much so that God either cannot or will not impose on that to make change in the way that the world works. So we'll see in a minute when we look at Calvinism. Calvinism emphasizes God's control, God's sovereignty. Arminians believe in God's sovereignty, but they believe that God's sovereignty is limited in relationship to human free will. Human freedom is the most important thing for him. Now, Arminianism is pretty much wiped out. There are probably a few churches today that would still claim that title for themselves, but there are actually a number of extremely popular and well-known churches that have some of the elements of this concept within their theology. The Evangelical Methodist Church, the Wesleyan Church, and the Salvation Army are three of them that are current denominations that highly emphasize free will and the freedom of humans to choose God or not to choose God over God's sovereignty, God's will being imposed on people. So, in relationship to this question about perseverance, one of the issues within Arminianism is this perseverance, or preservation is the word that I have here. That my perseverance is my responsibility wholly, because God can only give me salvation if I choose to accept it. And if I decide not to believe in it anymore, not to accept it anymore, then God's hands are tied, and too bad for me. I'm done. That's how it is. Now, with under the conditional election category and concept, God already knows that that's going to be what happens with me. But it's still my choice. It's up to me what I'm going to choose to do, even though God knows that it's going to happen. Karen, you're looking lost. You all right?
Oh, no, I'm just stretching my neck.
Oh, okay.
Uh, I have a thought, but I need to work on it a little bit.
All right, that's all right. We're gonna go over to Calvinism now, so it might come to you then. All right,
Okay.
so that's Arminianism. My perseverance in faith, in salvation, is my responsibility, more or less, wholly. So in response to Arminianism, we have John Calvin and the Calvinist movement. So in 1618, there was a gathering of theologians in the Dutch city of Dordrecht, or in the English Dort. They just called it Dort. And the purpose of this gathering was to deal with this growing Arminian perspective and belief. Is this okay? Is this orthodox, or is this heterodox heresy that we need to get rid of? And so in a way, this gathering and the writings, the canons that come out of it, are very similar to like the Nicene Creed, or the Council of Nicaea that we're a little bit more familiar with, because theologians got together to discuss an issue, and they wrote a response to that issue and said, we all are agreeing that this is how it is. This is what we're going to affirm as the Orthodox position in this on this issue. So these canons, these writings, are not intended to be um, a full theology, a systematic theology for the Reformed Church. They are just dealing with 5 points of theology that that are of concern to them in their response to Arminianism. And from these 5 canons, from these 5 issues, the canons are published and spread. Now, I don't know how many of you have read a lot of writings from the 16th and 17th centuries, but it's a lot, and especially because it's usually in translation of some European language like German, it becomes even more. So what happens over time is these concepts and these larger writings are kind of distilled down into more palatable form for modern Christians. And so you may be familiar with the theological concepts and the acronym that Calvinists and other Reformed Christians have called TULIP. Is anybody familiar with TULIP? A little bit. So Lutherans do not do TULIP. Don't think that I'm trying to tell you that this is the case or not. Just like with the Arminianism, this has got its own problems, and I'm going to tell you some of those problems as well. But because we're talking about perseverance and responsibility, we're going to talk about this. So in the early 20th century, they came up with this acronym TULIP to help people to remember the 5 concepts that came out of the Canons of Dort more than, well, almost 400 years earlier, I guess. So TULIP. TULIP stands for total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance or preservation of the saints. So these are the 5 things. Of course, those words don't really mean very much nowadays, just on their own, but that's what they came up with. And so then you're supposed to understand, what these concepts mean. So just to run through quickly-ish, total depravity means that humans are born in sin. We are fully dead in our sin. We are unable to save ourselves. There is nothing we can do. We are the scum under God's shoes, and we can't change that. It is what it is. We don't get to do anything. We don't get to decide. So when you compare this to over here, you can see that total depravity is a direct confrontation with this concept of free will, that humans are able to choose to accept Jesus. Because no, we can't. We are totally depraved. We are born sinful. Live sinful. We die sinful, except that Jesus intervenes for us. We don't get to choose. We can't choose. How can a dead person choose? They're dead. So that's that response. The U stands for unconditional election. God is the one who decides who is chosen. And it doesn't have anything to do with their actions. We don't earn our chosenness. God chooses us from God's goodness, or decides not to choose us because of the divine mystery. We're not supposed to question that. I'm going to question it in a minute. Spoiler alert. But we are to just understand that God has the full power here. We are totally dead. God chooses us to be elect, to be saved, and That's God's prerogative, and it has nothing to do with our actions. So again, direct contrast to Arminius and the conditional election, that God's hands are kind of tied. That election, God choosing me, is conditioned on me choosing God. No, remember, I can't choose God. Even if I wanted to, I wouldn't be able to, but I don't because I'm so far dead in my sin. But God chooses me unconditionally. My actions don't matter. Again, trying to attack this Arminian perspective, limited atonement versus unlimited atonement. So we talked about Jesus died for everyone. All you have to do is believe to be saved. For tulip believers, for tulip Calvinists, Christ didn't die for everyone. Christ died for the elect, those who have been chosen by God. And in fact, in a second, we're going to talk a little bit about double predestination. I stands for irresistible grace. God pulls in. God kind of, oh, hey, there's Jen.
I just found the little switch.
God reels in those who have been chosen, and we cannot resist that grace that God gives us. So again, we've got all of this free will stuff that we get to choose. Our freedom is higher than God's choices and God's actions, things like that. Over here, no. We are dead in our sins. God chooses us. And when that grace hits us, there is no way for us to resist it. We are going to be sucked right in to that grace. These things sound a little bit more familiar to you probably than that Arminianism stuff. Not quite exact, but very similar. Some different uses of language, but much closer. And then finally, we get to what we're trying to talk about here tonight: perseverance or preservation of the saints. So the reason I put both of the words on here is because originally it was perseverance, but they didn't like the use of the word perseverance as time went on, because it kind of refers back to that concept of like me doing the work, right? I persevere. And so preservation is a more passive descriptor. If I am persevering, I'm doing the work. If I am being preserved, somebody else is doing the work, and in this case, God. And so they kind of use these two different words. But the concept here is, because we are dead in our sin, because God does all the choosing and all the acting, because when God does that choosing and acting, we can't help but respond to it with that yes. Therefore, people who believe will persevere in their faith. They will be preserved in their faith. Their salvation is preserved, is assured, and they will eventually be with God forever. And so there's this assurance there that comes from a different place than over here. Here, your the assurance of your salvation, your perseverance to all the way to the end, is only assured because you choose it. But over here, it's assured all the way to the end because God chooses you. God chooses it for you. So, does this all make sense? I know it's a lot of extra information beyond our perseverance stuff, but I promise it matters. We'll get there. We good?
Mhm.
All right. So, when we talk about God's action outside of our ability to act, from from a Calvinist perspective, we're talking about the doctrine of predestination. Perseverance of the saints, this concept, is all about how um, if you are truly chosen by God, then there is security in for your salvation. There's security for your soul. There is security for who you are at the core because it all has to do with the fact that God predestined you for that destiny. God chose you before you were even born. Um, but then we have to look at real life, right? Like these theological concepts are real nice when they're, floating out there in the ether. But when we try to start actually applying them to real life, things start getting messy because being human is messy. And so all the way back to our good friend St. Augustine, they started asking some questions. If it is true that God determines how everything was going to happen, who was going to be saved and who wasn't, or whether everybody was going to be saved, or whatever you believe about that. And it's true that once those people are saved, they are saved forever. Their salvation is eternally secure. Then why do some persevere in living faithful lives after they are baptized into Christ and others don't?
That's what I was going to ask that question.
Yeah. So you're not
Even
alone. We've been asking
even
this for hundreds of
even if
years.
God chooses you or you're elected by God, you're one of the chosen ones. What if you decide you don't want to follow
Yeah.
God?
So Augustine is trying to explain why some people who got baptized continue in their faith and grow in their faith and spend the rest of their lives working toward, becoming the people that God claimed them to be in their baptism, while others get baptized, whether by their choice or not, and they are like, nah, I'm not into that. I'm gonna go do my own thing. I'm gonna go, drinking and carousing and worshiping other gods or worshiping the god of money or, whatever it is that they decide they want to do with their lives. How is this possible? Augustine is asking this question. So, what he comes up with is that anybody who is baptized receives the new life that God offers them as that gift of grace through Jesus Christ in their baptism. And in addition to that, some people also receive the gift of perseverance, which allows them to keep moving through their lives in a faithful way so that they don't fall away from their faith. So, what Augustine eventually decides in this is if you don't get both of those gifts, even though you're baptized, you would not persevere in your faith, and ultimately, your baptism will not save you. Baptism itself, Augustine says, is not enough to guarantee salvation. And so, therefore, I say, okay, well, then why get baptized, right? Because it doesn't mean anything. But he's trying to work out this issue. So then several hundred years go by, people are still struggling with these questions, and then we get to Calvin, who is important for this because he's the tulip. Well, he's not the personal tulip guy, but his tradition is the tulip thing. And so we get to this concept about double predestination. So this is another thing that I struggle and criticize, but I'll tell you about it because that's what we're doing today. Calvin believed that God gets to decide, only God gets to decide whether an individual is going to receive salvation or damnation. So I have a quote from him here. By predestination, we mean the eternal decree of God, by which he determined with himself whatever he wished to happen with regard to every man. All are not created on equal terms, but some are preordained to eternal life, others to eternal damnation. And accordingly, as each has been created for one or the other of these ends, we say that he has been predestinated to life or to death. So, according to Calvin, some people are born saved and others are born damned. I have a huge problem with that. I could
I
go
do
on
too.
and on and on. In fact, I have, I think, in this class sometimes because I've talked a lot about how our good friend Karl Barth reinterpreted this concept of double predestination, and I like his way better. But that's not where what we're talking about today. So we'll talk about that another day. Right? So that's where we are currently right now. So
My
everybody right
question,
here, disagreeing is fine, but do we understand?
I just have a question about how one would know that you are chosen.
Aha, we're gonna get to that in a minute.
Okay. And or if you're or if well if you know that you are, being sent to, into a life of damnation, why bother? I mean, such no hope. I mean,
Yep.
anyway, I'm sure you'll get to that.
You get a much
It's
more
just bringing up more
fun
questions.
interpretation of that twist, or more interesting twist on that when you're like, well, if I know I'm saved, let's start doing some evil.
Right, right.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
So,
that's my whole thing.
I mean, that's the twisted side of this.
Right.
Yeah,
So here's the concern, and here's why I brought up the entirety of Tulip and not just the perseverance concept, because all of these things, interact with each other. And I think we've got a problem here because we have perseverance on the one hand. If you are if you are saved, then it shows in your life, right? You persevere in your faith. But God's grace is irresistible. So, if God's grace is irresistible, if as soon as you touch that grace, it's it's all done. It's like love at first sight. You can't the whole rest of your life is laid out in front of you. You are going to marry this person, you know. There's no way around it. But it seems like that's not the case with God's grace sometimes. People are baptized, people affirm their faith, people some denominations have altar calls where you go forward and you commit your life to Jesus and you pray the sinner's prayer and ask Jesus to come into your heart and all these things. And then later they fall away from that. How is that possible? If God's grace is irresistible, if we if we can't do anything on our own, if we are dead in our sin, and the only thing that makes us alive together with Christ is God's grace, that means that we have to have gotten God's grace somewhere if we're going to even make that choice for God in that moment. But somehow we then later start to resist the irresistible grace. That doesn't make any sense. So what Calvin came up with, and all of this is just so convoluted. But what Calvin came up with is the concept of what he called evanescent grace, or um, temporary grace is another way of saying it. So if you are a true Christian, if you have truly been chosen by God, elect by God for salvation, then you will persevere all the way to the end of your life and beyond. But being a true Christian is only demonstrated by persevering to the end. And so it's all in retrospect. Jen, you asked, how do you know? You know because you die and you're still good with God. But that kind of defeats the whole point, right? Because all of these questions are all because these guys are all completely obsessed with understanding how do I ensure that I am saved. And so if the answer is you wait until you die, then that doesn't really help the issue at all, does it?
Yeah, why would you want to pursue? I mean, persevere.
Well, you get a lifetime of minor neuroses.
Yeah. Hi. I'm in that club.
Yes.
So when I was in youth group, I was when I was a teenager, my family was at a Presbyterian church, and they are staunch predestinationers. And we had arguments about this. They called it backsliding. If you're a Christian, if you're baptized, if you've affirmed your faith, if you've been working on yourself and working on your relationship with God and going to church and doing all the things you're supposed to do, and then all of a sudden one day you stop doing it, that's called backsliding. Well, is that a real thing? Because if you're backsliding, then that means that God has abandoned you, or that means that God's grace is not effective in your life anymore, or that means that you've been able to resist God's grace. And so some people said, no, 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 there's no such thing as backsliding. If you backslide, that means that you were never a Christian in the first place. You thought you were, but you weren't. Well, when you're 15 years old and you're trying to figure out whether if you get hit by a bus tomorrow, you're going to be in heaven, and you're freaking out about that because that's what everybody tells you you need to be worried about all the time, and you don't know, that is not very encouraging. But this is what Calvin did. So Calvin, or Calvinist theologians, I shouldn't put all of this just on him because he has, lots and lots of people coming after him. But they came up with this idea that there are varieties of types of grace, including this idea of temporary grace. That God's temporary or common types of grace are available to anyone at any time. So, for example, if I'm a Muslim or an atheist, and I'm out in the world walking, taking a walk, and I'm breathing clean air and I'm looking at all the beauty around me, that's an experience of God's common grace. I can receive that gift from God without my life being changed in terms of, my salvation, and in terms of my need to respond to it in faithfulness and perseverance in that faith. But then if you kind of keep moving forward with that, eventually you might realize that, oh, God has been using this common grace to kind of draw me in, and now the irresistible grace kicks in, and now I discover that, oh, I'm one of the elect. I'm part of this, and so now I'm buying into this whole system. So all these different types of grace are stacked on top of each other and intertwined all over the place. But that irresistible grace is only for the people who were chosen. And the only way for you to know if you've received that irresistible grace is to persevere until you die. So I don't know about you, but this is not very helpful to me in terms of any of this stuff. This whole concept of perseverance and, continuing to live our lives for God. We could say, oh, well, I understand these things and I'm going to work hard at these things because God loves me and because God has given me all of these gifts, and I'm going to continue doing this. But then some days I just don't feel like it, right? Like I had a bad day. I'm tired. My house is freezing cold. I don't want to get out of bed. I'm grumpy. I don't want to deal with any of this stuff. I'm mad. So does that mean that today I'm not a Christian? Today I'm not saved? Today, I'm not persevering in my faith, and so I'm all
I hope
done?
not. I think you just described me today. So
One day.
Um, or not. It doesn't, none of this is particularly helpful to me. I think, from my personal experience, it's certainly easy to fall into the trap of this constant fear and worry when everybody else around you is also in that place of fear and worry and trying to wrestle with this same question. Um, it's it's difficult, um, in a lot of different ways, um, because there's no assurance ever, right? Like on any given day, nobody can be perfect. And so how do where the line is? You don't. And so it turns into, frankly, a lot of, judging of other people and even judging of yourself and I am surprised that there are honestly not more Christians out there doing what Martin Luther did for years and you know throwing themselves on the floor and fasting until their belly buttons touch their spines and all of these things because they're so freaked out about all of this stuff.
I'm not sure we don't actually see a little of that, because if you go into some of the more newer American derived versions of Christianity where it's a lot more, I make this choice. I've noticed that they get into the cycle of, did I make the right choice? Is this the right choice here? Is it no, no, maybe it was the right choice over here.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost the same trap as the Calvinists get into, only from a completely different basis.
So it's interesting that you say that because so growing up in more or less in a Calvinist from a Calvinist perspective, and then going to seminary and learning about the Arminian controversies and how a lot of the Calvinist theology and the things that they emphasize came out of that disagreement. It actually feels a lot to me like what they did was they came to this determination. Okay, well, theologically, logically, we can't go anywhere besides to say that if you are chosen, then you will persevere until the end. And so then you can't know if you are truly chosen until you get to the end. And so then it becomes, then they kind of revert to Arminianism, actually. Like you claim you're a Calvinist, but then it all becomes about my own personal choices, right? And then all of a sudden it's not, you're not thinking, I don't think you go so far as to think, truly think, oh well, it's my free will to decide who wins and loses here. But you have convinced yourself that the only way to know is to make the choices. And so then in your behaviors you kind of take that responsibility back from God, even though even though what you claim to believe is that God is in control of all of this, your behavior says otherwise. In fact, the complete opposite.
Yeah,
Karen, something?
I just kind of go back to the original question, what is Christian perseverance? And when you mentioned the title, the first thing I thought about is, how do we get through suffering, through our troubles or difficult times, how do you persevere? And to me, it's just, number one, having faith, turning your will and your life over to the care of God on a daily and surrendering, because I can't change other people, places, and things. All I can do is work on me through, have God uh, help me get through things. And so I feel like whether it's predetermined, predestined, I still have, in order to live life to the fullest, even to have a joyful life, that I can't do. I can't do this life on my own. I have to have a God of my understanding. I have to have God take the load, and so that's kind of how I persevere. Is I turn it over to God when I get in a stressful situation. Just pause and, okay, God. And I'm probably oversimplifying, but that's just my direct my first gut, instinct to how to answer that question.
Well, that's a really good transition, Jen, because I think this is the very first time this is ever happening. I am going to answer this question with my with
Oh,
my answer.
yeah. I
And
love that.
here we go. So we've talked about perseverance. Is it my responsibility to persevere? Is it God's responsibility to make me persevere? I want to talk about how God takes responsibility for us and we take responsibility for each other. Because I think that's something that is really, really difficult about being a Christian in the United States at this time. And it's getting worse and worse as years go by and as new politicians come into play, is that we have turned Christianity into a single player game. It's all about me. It's all about my relationship with God. It's all about my salvation. It's all about where I'm going when I die. It's all about whether I am getting something out of this. It's all about whether God is approving of me personally. And we completely lose the community aspect of this. There are so many Christians and even people who should know better, people who grew up Lutheran, people who grew up Presbyterian, who say, well, I don't go to church anymore because I just worship by myself at home. And yeah, there are circumstances in which that's the best you can get, right? That you're sick or you're injured or you're living in the middle of the mountains and you're snowed in for 6 months out of the year. I'm not saying that that's not possible, but we, in my understanding, according to, psychology and biology and theology, we are built to live in community with each other. And the Bible tells us and shows us that we are responsible for each other, not just in terms of taking care of each other's physical needs and social needs, but actually in terms of making sure that our spiritual needs are taken care of and our relationship with God is going well. So I want to share with you two passages that have something to do with this. The first one is from Job chapter 42. So Job, if you read the first chapter of Job and the last chapter, not the full chapters, but the first section of Job and the last section of Job, it's a very cute, short little folk tale about a man who was faithful to God. And because Satan decided that, he wanted to cause stir up some trouble, he took everything away from Job, including his wealth and his family and his health. And Job was faithful anyway. And so God gave it all back and said, ha ha, Satan, see, Job is a faithful guy, even though, you took away all his stuff. And then God gave everything back to Job. And if you don't think about the part where he gets his family, his family is replaced with new children and, who cares about those other children that all died horribly, then, it's a happy little fairy tale. But the center of the majority of this, and this is chapter 42, so it's a lot of text, is wrestling with this question of why do bad things happen to good people? And in the story, Job has four friends who come to visit him while he is mourning, while he is dealing with the fact that God is punishing him. And they all say to Job, well, it's clear that you did something wrong. And so you need to repent. You need to, you need to admit what you did that was wrong and ask God's forgiveness. And then everything will be okay again. And Job said, no, 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 that's not true. I didn't do anything wrong. This is something else. And so they just go back and forth for literally, you know, dozens of chapters here. And then finally, God intervenes and talks to Job. And then God turns to the friends. And God says, my wrath is kindled against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now, therefore, take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering. And my servant Job shall pray for you, and I will accept his prayer not to deal with you according to your folly. For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has done. So they did what the Lord had told them, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer. This is so anti what we do today, right? You don't involve other people in your reconciliation with God.
Mhm.
You go off on your own and you admit your sins to by yourself to God. If you're Catholic, you go and you tell the priest, but the priest isn't really a person necessarily. The priest is representing God in that situation. Um, but this suggests that there is actually a role for other people, for your community in your perseverance, in your building of your relationship with God, and in God's building of a relationship with you. And that's not something that we do really today necessarily, not very often anyway. And it's interesting because that the instructions were to do this through Job, right? So what if they had tried to do it on their own? Would God have accepted it? Probably not, because that was not the instruction that they were given. Um, but it's an interesting juxtaposition, this versus what we're used to kind of seeing in our society. And this is not just an Old Testament thing. We've got Luke chapter 5, a familiar story now. Jesus is teaching in a small house, and there is a crowd of people around it, and they couldn't get into the door. And so they came along carrying their paralyzed friend on a bed, and they were trying to bring him in and lay him before Jesus, but finding no way to bring him in because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and let him down with his bed through the tiles into the middle of the crowd in front of Jesus. And then here's the part I think that even if we're familiar with this story from childhood, we forget. It says, when Jesus saw their faith, he said, "Friend, your sins are forgiven." The faith of the friends is what makes Jesus respond and forgive the sins of the paralyzed man. And then the story goes on that, the Pharisees get angry because how dare you forgive somebody's sins? And then Jesus says, okay, well, if you think that I shouldn't be forgiving sins, then how about I heal the guy? And then I can prove that I should be forgiving sins. And he does that. None of this is done because of anything that the man himself has done. He has not earned any of this. Jesus explicitly says that he is making these choices to help this guy based on the faith of the friends. And this is what changed my whole understanding of faith and salvation and my relationship with God. That, when we talk about the Reformation in terms of faith alone, it's so easy in our individualized world to get it in our heads that, okay, well, then I have to have faith, right? If it's faith alone, then it's faith alone, and I've got to have the right faith. I'm alone in this. But again and again, our scripture reminds us that that's not how this works. That yes, our relationship with God is based on faith, a faith that is a gift to us from God, and sometimes a gift to us from our friends, from our community of faith. And so I no longer worry about whether my relationship with God is right now or will be right enough to get me in at the end. I no longer worry if I'm persevering enough so that at the end I've persevered to the end. Because in those moments when I'm grumpy and my house is too cold and I didn't eat enough today and I didn't get enough sleep and I'm mad at God because something, is happening in the world that I don't think is right and shouldn't be happening, or, I've had some major tragedy in my life and I'm blaming God and I'm angry with God, I have a community of faith that can carry me and have faith for me. And for God, that's enough. And I think that to me is the good news. That to me is grace. So
Well,
faith is not a personal issue. We we are literally and figuratively called to carry each other during difficult times in our lives. And that's what this story tells me. So, what is Christian perseverance? It is enduring in our faith through adversity with the knowledge that God is with us in the form of the Spirit and in the form of our community. It's trusting that God will preserve the Christian community as a whole over time, even if it looks different than now. This is something I just wanted to toss in there because I think as things are changing, and I've said this many times over the last almost decade now, since 2017 passed, every 500 years or so, there is an absolute shift in what Christianity looks like. There's a huge upheaval. But on the other end, it perseveres. God preserves our community. And so trusting that God will do that, even as we watch it changing and we worry about the shifts and where's the Sunday school and where are our children gone and what's going to happen to our churches. 50 or 100 years from now, the church is probably not going to look anything like it does right now. But that's okay because God is there. And so to me, Christian perseverance, the preservation side of things, is that promise that God is going to preserve God's church. God is going to be there to help Christianity persevere. And then finally, Christian perseverance is supporting other Christians in times of need. I don't have to persevere on my own. I don't have to fight that little jagged line of climbing and falling by myself because God gives me the gift of community. So, Cindy, you've come to pretty much every single one of these classes forever. Have I ever thoroughly answered a question like I just answered the question?
Absolutely not. My mind is still boggled, but at least I have an answer.
I love it.
I think this was a really important one because all of this stuff that we've talked about, it's interesting, it's helpful to, wrestle with and think about the history and everything like that. But I think fundamentally it forgets who we are in community with one another. And so that's why I really needed to come wrap it up with that today. So sorry, usually I leave it a little more free and let you disagree with me and certainly continue to disagree with me. I'm happy to hear it, but I needed to get that out today.
Well, I need to put in my 2 cents too, because over the last 2 or 3 years, I haven't been able to attend church because of illnesses and different things that have happened. And but I was able to stay connected online.
Mhm.
And so I felt like I was part of the community, but I don't think the community felt that I was part. And so I finally have gotten myself to the point where I actually was at church on Sunday.
Oh, yeah.
And I know that I need to be with my fellow Christians. I know that. And I've finally gotten to the point where I'm able to do that. And it feels good. It feels good to be there and to be welcomed and everything. But this time that I've spent alone and just being able to do it online, I don't understand what you're saying about that. About I know, I knew I needed the community, but I wasn't able to be there.
And
So
I think that speaks to how the Christian community is looking different as time goes on. I think what you just said is actually a really important area that the church as a whole and St. James in particular needs to work on, because it's true that people who worship with us online are an essential part of our worshiping community. But how to make that apparent to the people who come in person, and even to the other people, when you worship online, you can see that other people have watched the video, but you don't know who those people are. And it's so difficult to figure out, how do we connect with these people? How do we figure out who it is that is worshiping with us this Sunday, and what their needs are, and who they are, and why they're here, and all those types of things. And then to bring that to the worship space, and recognize it and acknowledge it, and make sure that the people who are in the physical space and can see most of the other people are aware of that dynamic, is a huge challenge for church leaders, and certainly something that St. James has a lot of work to do to
I agree.
address.
I agree. I've been trying to um, think of my own self. How could I be more connected? When I wasn't able to be there, and it's very difficult.
Hmm.
It's very, very difficult, especially if you've come from the place where you were there every Sunday.
Right, right.
um, it's a big change. It's a big change.
Yeah.
But
COVID gave us, COVID gave us new challenges. COVID made us appreciate being together more, because we couldn't do it for a long time. No, none of us could. But now COVID has also given us new challenges to deal with, because before, if you couldn't be there, you just were done, right? You were gone. You weren't part of the community anymore,
right, right,
which is not good. You don't want that. I'm not saying we want to go back to that, but now that there's some connection, we have to figure out, how do we make that connection real for on both ends.
I agree.
And I don't have any answers to that question at this point, but it's something that I know we need to work on.
Yeah, but I think just recognizing the fact that um, you do need that community. It's
Hmm.
not it's it's not a do-it-yourself thing.
Yeah,
You know. Yeah.
good. Thank you, Karen. Any other thoughts?
Is there a platform that allows for more interaction? For instance, where people could type in their prayer requests, or somehow acknowledge their presence on a Sunday morning without it being disruptive to the service, but be received at the church.
So we tried several different things over the course of the years. During COVID, for a while, I don't know if you remember this, but for a while, instead of just posting the service to YouTube, we also had a time when it was posted to Facebook. And it was when it went live, everybody was supposed to come at that time and interact with each other, and nobody wanted to interact. They said it was distracting from the service, and they they didn't want to be chatting, and when the chat was going and other people were chatting, they didn't like it because it was distracting them from the service. So then we stopped doing that. We went back to the YouTube. Um, we've had we've had online forms that we put into the chat on the YouTube, and tell people, go in here and let us know that you're here, very similar to the sheets that people fill out on Sunday morning. And put your name, put your email address, put your address, put your prayer requests, things like that on there. And nobody really was using it. One or two people a month maybe would click on it and actually fill it out. For a while, we had somebody whose job it was not just to run the show and push the buttons, but to sit there and do the chatting and ask questions and help people to try to interact with what was going on in the room. And there was just so little to no response that we've stopped all of those things at this point. We can't, we can't just stop and say, well, they don't want it. We have to figure out, what is it that people need, and how do we give it to them better. My perspective is, I think we start with doing more recognizing of the people online, within the worship service, but I'm not always up there. I'm up there maybe every 2 or 3 months, and I don't do it because we get out of the habit of it. But to acknowledge maybe at communion time, instead of just going into the communion, saying, "Hey, if you're online, grab some crackers and juice and join us." But then people in the room complain because that's disruptive to their experience. And during the announcements, sometimes for a while we were having Pastor Bob greet the people that are online and welcome them and remind everybody in the room that those people are here and that they are part of our worshiping community. But we haven't really done much of that lately either. So that's something that is a big challenge, and I think we need to keep on thinking about ways that we can address it. So if you have ideas, please give them to the office because we want to work on that.
Well, I mean, I mean, inherently I'm an outsider, and my congregation is awful mobile. As we have people who spend half the year off in Alaska and go off to New Mexico on month-long jaunts and whatnot. And one of the things like we've had, I mean, we're primarily Facebook, and one of the challenges we've had is we've tried to move to YouTube, is we're trying not to lose the community by splitting into two chunks.
Right.
And so we haven't figured that piece out yet. But like some of the people call in and, Pastor Mark is, very explicitly, he's like, all right, everybody say hello to, Sandy. She's on the phone. And the entire congregation goes in, does that. And then one of the things that, at least when I was there, is different than the way we do it, is we do individualized prayer rather than the generic world prayer and local prayer or whatnot. We do individualized ones. And we try to remember to grab the Facebook people who are putting into the chat what they need, what prayer they want to get it out, to get it on there. We also still use a lot of communion cups and whatnot, so that when people run off, they are taking, from the church, the bread and the wine. And it's those little things seems to have helped keep our people who are not in church that week, of which I'm guilty far too often for being not out of the state or doing something else weird. But it seems to have helped keep it bound together despite distances and whatnot. And the other thing is that when communion happens, the first thing that happens is the people who are taking it in the pews take it in the pews. The people who are online get your bread and your water or wine and go. And then communion proceeds, and it's just the natural flow of it. And yeah, I mean, you'll run into people who get a little grouchy about it, but you're going to get grouchy about something. And there are some hills worth fighting on. So
Yeah.
To remember that, no, these are still part of the people who, if they were baptized in there, you promised to, watch out for.
Yeah.
So, that's what we've been doing. It seems to work reasonably well, but we have been trying to get better at it. As we've been dancing around with trying to figure out, because we used to be 3 services before COVID, and now we're down to 1, and it's a combination service similar to what you guys did. And so we're introducing some liturgy, and we take out a little liturgy here, and it's kind of just ebbs and flows. As the people who want a modern service versus the high traditional kind of jockey back and forth. But it, for the most part, everyone in the congregation has been happier at the fact we aren't doing more services, not because they like the time, they would much prefer the separation for that, but they do appreciate the fact that the younger people and the older people are now know who they know who each other are.
Yeah, it's one congregation rather than 3.
Yeah.
Yeah, you get a lot of that with services, with churches that have more than one service. It's almost like it's multiple congregations using the same building.
Exactly. Yeah.
So really, there's always been that challenge. It just looks different now, right? It used to be, well, if I was an 8 o'clock service person, then I'm not in community with the 10 o'clock service people. But now it's, well, if I'm an in-person worshiper, then I'm not in community with the online people. And yeah, it continues to change, but if we trust and are faithful and knowing that God is guiding it and will preserve the communities, even if our personal community isn't around or it doesn't look anything like what we wanted it to look like in 50 or 100 years, then it's where God wants it to be, and we follow that, hopefully.
Yeah.
We try anyway, together.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even on days when we won our organ hymns, gosh darn it.
I was just going to say, in addition to our worship service, there are so many opportunities at our church to be in community, whether it's Bible study or all the ministries that our church are involved in, in the church, in the community. And that's another way to really connect with your people.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, this Bible study connects people, connects us.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can't drive, or if you're, you know, ill or injured or something, if you can't get to church,
Makes it hard.
this is the only connection.
Yeah.
And so I've really missed our Bible studies, because it does bring me into the community.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we need to remember that, and maybe even expand it. I don't know.
Well, we need to talk soon. I think we're gonna wait for this in the fall, because I think it will be something that will be of interest to people as we approach the holiday season. But Cindy has asked a question that I think is going to take more than just one mixed bag musing session. She wants us to look at holidays and traditions in different religions. And so I think it would be interesting for us to consider whether we can make a commitment. We all get really busy and things are happening and everything, and so we decided to go down to once a month. But I wonder if in the fall we could decide together in October and November we could do it every week and have it be something that we expand and we advertise a little bit more and see if we could get some more people involved in that series. So it would still be our Zoom Bible study, but it would be kind of a special thing to try to attract some more people and address something of interest to hopefully
Yeah,
additional people. So that might be a way for us to do that.
good idea.
That's a great idea. That's good.
All right. Any
Okay.
other final thoughts?
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you
you
so much.
all.
That was rich. I loved it.
All right. So next month, Tuesday, March 18th is our scheduled day. And this is Karen's question. She actually asked it to me a little bit easier. So I'll think about both of these. I put, how should I interact with people who hold different political views? She asked me, how do I love people I don't like?
Yes.
Which I like a lot better than this. So we'll talk about that one next time, which I think is timely and important, critically important, as we respond to political changes
Well,
that are happening in our world.
it doesn't have to be just political views either. There's a lot of different views.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks
Okay.
everybody.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good
Good
night.
night.
Thank
I'll
thank
see
you.
some of you on Sunday. Okay.